When we went into this lockdown, I thought it would be easier than the previous ones. How wrong I was. For many of us, this lockdown has been far harder. Far, far harder. From chatting to some of you on doorsteps and on Zoom, and from looking at my own life and family, I know that many of us are finding things absolutely exhausting at the moment. We are really struggling. We're exhausted emotionally by the stresses of homeschooling and the strain of not being able to meet up with the people we love. We're exhausted emotionally by isolation or by being cooped up with the same people day after day after day. We're exhausted physically because it's harder to exercise, and sadly some of us are still feeling the effects of COVID. We're exhausted mentally. Although COVID numbers are going down, we know that the rates of mental illness are escalating, even in young children. We're exhausted spiritually. The lack of fellowship weakens us because we're not designed to live the Christian life alone. And our typical British superficiality is wearing very thin. How are you? I'm okay, we reply. But this is the time to be real and honest. How are you? I'm not okay. I have been really struggling. How are you? On Ash Wednesday, we normally think about Jesus' temptations in the desert, or we talk about fasting. But today I want us to think about weakness. How do you think Jesus felt after 40 days without food? I bet he was not just physically exhausted and weak, but also emotionally, mentally, and spiritually feeling the strain too. So I'm going to offer some reflections for a few minutes, and then depending on how much time you've got, there's some questions you can work through and there's some music that you can listen to. You see, our culture admires strength. We like strong leaders. We respect physically strong sports people. We admire emotionally strong people and those who are self-sufficient. We tend to look down on weakness, hence why we say that we're okay even when we know we're not. We want to appear strong because we think other people will respect us more. And as I've been feeling weak over these last few weeks, I've been reminded that weakness is a key part of God's plans. It's not just that Jesus was born in weakness and that he died in weakness, but that actually our weakness is vital for God's work. Do you remember the story of Gideon? He started with an army of 32,000 men, but God knew that if they won the battle with that many people, they would be proud and take the credit themselves. So God whittled down the army to just 300 men. And it was when Gideon hid from the enemy and admitted his weaknesses that God was then able to work in power and bring an incredible victory. Or think of Joshua. He was probably in his 70s when he took over the leadership of God's people and was commissioned to enter the Promised Land. He had to lead an army that had never fought a single battle before. God told him to be strong and courageous. Why? Because he was weak and scared. And I keep coming back in my thinking to the Apostle Paul. We tend to think of him as strong, don't we? But he told the Corinthian church that he came to them in weakness with great fear and trembling. He told them how he'd been in prison frequently and flogged 5 times and beaten 3 times and stoned once and shipwrecked 3 times, including spending a day and night in the open sea. He was under attack from both Jews and Gentiles. He often went without sleep and food. He had been cold and naked. And he asked them, "Who is weak and I do not feel weak?" So Paul knew weakness very well. And then to make matters worse, he was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment him. Now, we don't know what that thorn was, whether it was some physical ailments or some person who was hounding him or a situation that he desperately wanted to get out of. But whatever it was the last thing he wanted or needed. It was the final straw for him. I wonder what the final straw has been for you over the last few weeks. When things have already been bad and difficult, and then something else comes along to make things even worse. And Paul says that this thorn tormented him. He was worrying about it night and day, fearful about how he would cope. He saw Satan's hand at work in this, trying to drag him down. And so he pleaded with the Lord, "Lord, I can't cope with this. Will you take it away?" No answer. "Lord, can you hear me? After all I've done for you, will you just give me a break and get rid of this for me?" No answer. "God, I can't cope. Make this stop. I'm at breaking point. I'm on my knees begging you, please take this away." And then God answered, but not in the way Paul wanted. The Lord said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." In other words, I want you weak because that's when you get to see my power. I guess there was sort of encouragement for Paul there in the answer from God, that God's grace would be sufficient for Paul, and that Paul would get to see God's power at work. But that really wasn't how Paul wanted God to see God's grace and power. He wanted God's power to take the thorn away. But God knew better. I have in my mind a picture of a 5-year-old playing cricket and trying to hit the ball to the boundary, but barely being strong enough to get it back as far as the bowler. That child tries and tries and tries, but simply doesn't have the strength to hit it that far. Eventually the child lets their mum or dad come and lean over them and hold the bat with them, and the bowler bowls, and they smash it straight over the bowler's head and for a straight 6. But you see, it's only when we admit that we are weak that we get to see our Heavenly Father's power. Just as it's only when the child admits they're weak that they get to see their parents' power. And as adults, we want to be strong. Strong for our families and friends, for our colleagues and neighbours. But God is stripping all of that away, isn't he? He's telling us that we're like the 5-year-old. We're simply not strong enough. We need his help. But he can only give us his help and show us his power when we admit that we can't cope, that we're weak, and we need him to act. You see, Paul was already weak, and then God let him have additional weaknesses. In a strange way, it was like a gift to him. A gift that he absolutely did not want to receive. But when he heard God's perspective, that God's power is made perfect in our weaknesses, well, then Paul learned to receive this gift and even embrace this gift. He said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Now, none of us wants this gift of weakness. But can we begin to look at it differently? To realise that God's power can only be made perfect in our weakness? Can we even begin to embrace our weakness? And as Paul reflected on this further, he saw what God's purpose was. He realised that this was to keep him from becoming conceited. You see, when we're strong, we're proud. And this unwanted gift of weakness chips away at our pride. At the moment, it feels as though it's smashing our pride to smithereens. The apostles James and Peter both remind us that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So here's the thing. God views our strength as weakness because it makes us proud. And God views our weakness as strength because it makes us humble. So this Lent, what are you going to give up? So many of us are giving up so much already. But I wonder whether God is simply asking us to give up our pride and our self-sufficiency. To acknowledge that we're not as strong as we like to think that we are, and to say, look, I can't cope. And then what are we going to take up this Lent? I wonder if God is asking us to take up weakness and humility, and to receive weakness as a gift that God can use. This pandemic is bringing many of us metaphorically to our knees. But maybe that's what God actually wants us to do, to be on our knees, expressing our weakness, crying out to him in prayer. For his power is made perfect in our weakness. We can get on our knees knowing that his grace is sufficient for whatever we are facing. So, in this difficult season, would you be real with God? He can only work in power and give us his all-sufficient grace when we acknowledge our weakness. Yes, it hurts our ego. We like to be the strong and dependable ones, the one to help others. But admitting our weakness reminds us that he's the Messiah, not us. He's the one who helps and saves, not us. And can I encourage you to be real with each other? Paul was vulnerable. He shared his weaknesses with the Corinthians, and so must we. We're not designed to be independent, self-sufficient Christians. God designed us to be interdependent on each other. But we can only receive help if we first admit our need and our weakness. If you feel weak, as I do, be encouraged. Our weakness isn't a hindrance, but a help in God's plans and purposes. Our weakness is actually our qualification for God's power to work in us. His grace is sufficient for whatever challenges you face at the moment. I'd encourage you to take a few minutes now just to ponder on that. And if you've got time to work through the questions, and if you want to listen to some of the music to help you respond to God in weakness and yet in worship for the way that he perfects his power through our weaknesses.